It's it's the Hero Show. Welcome to the Hero Show, everybody. Starring the irrepressible Andrew Bernstein and the revengeful Robert Begley. I am Andrew Bernstein, and you are indubitably Robert Begley. How you doing this afternoon, Robert?
I'm doing okay, Andy. Not great as usual, due to the subject matter. Because yeah, let's take some revenge on one of the main villains in American education today. So my
John
mood
Dewey.
is not as chipper as that's right, John Dewey. Not as
Yeah.
chipper as normal, but we have to do these
Uh,
things sometimes
yeah.
and show the contrast from heroes need villains for the heroism to rise even higher. And we have a big one today.
Yeah, absolutely. It's Halloween. Well, it's gonna be Halloween in a few days. It's the time to be scared of ghouls and goblins and all kinds of evil creatures, and it's appropriate to be scared of this character, John Dewey. Yeah, John Dewey, widely recognized amongst many people as the prime. The American schooling is in the toilet. I mean, it's in terrible condition. Dewey. A lot of people accurately and properly, point the figure at Dewey as the prime mover of the disaster. And we need to give a little background on what American schooling was like prior to progressive education, and how good it
Yes.
was. But
Hmm.
Dewey, okay, now Dewey, his look at his dates, by the way, 1859 to 1952. I mean, he was
Long
almost
time.
93. Yeah, he was almost
Yeah.
93 when he passed away. I mean, he lived, just think about this, Robert. He lived from before the Civil War into the space age.
Yeah.
Sputnik was launched just a few years
Hmm.
after his death, into the nuclear age. We could put it that way. That's an
Yes.
extraordinary, change in human society, certainly in the Western world during Dewey's lifetime.
Hmm. Hmm.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah,
And no, and that shows the the periods. We have the progressive era. We have the, like you said, right after the Civil War, Reconstruction, progressive era, Roaring Twenties, wars. World War One, World War Two. Yeah, he lived through all of these pivotal moments in America, certainly in American history. But let's go with his impact.
from I'm just thinking in terms of president. I don't remember who was president before Lincoln. I don't remember, but Lincoln was elected.
Buchanan, James Buchanan.
All right,
James.
thank you, Robert. So Dewey went from Buchanan to Truman. I mean, think that's an
Yeah.
extraordinarily long,
Yeah.
long lifetime.
Yes. Ooh,
To the
wow.
year that Eisenhower was elected, right? Eisenhower was elected in November of 52. Ike uh, was
Hmm.
elected. But anyhow,
Hmm.
yeah. So it's an amazing life. I don't know all that much about his background, his early years. Do you know much about his early years and his I could talk
Well,
about grad school, for Dewey and what his PhD was in and everything. But his early education, do you know much about it?
just no, not much. That he was from a well-off family. It wasn't, the rags to riches story that we hear so often and that we cover in, on the Hero Show. But he was intelligent. He was definitely bright at
Oh yeah, no doubt.
in school. And yeah, so let's just go right into academia and
Yeah.
his
Okay. Sure.
achievements there.
Sure. Because
Mhm.
that's where his influence originates. He's
Yeah.
from Vermont, by the way. He was born and raised
Yes.
in Vermont, um, and so we should point that out. But Dewey is famous for several things. One, he's one of the leading figures in the philosophy of pragmatism, which is
Yes.
the distinctively American contribution to the history of philosophy, and then two, maybe even more than pragmatism, for progressive education. So,
Right.
so Dewey got a PhD in philosophy from Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, prestigious, highly rated
Hmm.
school. wrote his doctoral dissertation on Immanuel Kant. I think it was, yeah, it's appropriate. I
Yes.
think it was something about the psychological work of Kant, if I remember correctly.
Hmm.
And the dissertation is lost today. It's just, so
Okay.
it's
Hmm.
yeah, so it's, from what I was reading, it's unavailable. But definitely wrote his dissertation on Kant, and was a great admirer of George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, another, famous and impactful German philosopher. And I remember, Robin, it was torture. Trying to read Hegel is just. I think I'd rather take a beating than try to read the Phenomenology of Spirit, his main work in
Yeah.
metaphysics,
Hmm.
Hegel. I mean, but Dewey's main
Yes.
work, Experience in Nature, you could see the Hegelian influences. Oh God, it's just torture. Is to try and try and make sense out of it. Now, one thing we can say about
Hmm.
Hegel that I think is important for Dewey is politically, Hegel's book, The Philosophy of Right, is intelligible. It's readable, and Hegel very clearly is a staunch collectivist. He said, the
Hmm.
mankind as a whole, takes precedence over the individual. The state is supreme. The individual serves the state. Hegel was a devout, what's known as state worshiper. At one point in The Philosophy of Right, he says in so many words, I don't remember the exact quote, but to the effect that, an individual's life belongs to the state. And if the state calls upon an individual to give that life, well, then the life must be given. I go, so I remember,
Yes.
as an American, and of course as an objectivist reading, I was like, oh, that is absolutely horrifying, coming from the most influential philosopher of the
Yeah.
19th century, Hegel. So Dewey is in
But
that
Andy,
Hegelian. Yeah, go ahead.
can I just jump in, right, Andy? That view of Hegel, and we can talk about him,
Yeah,
on
Future
and on,
Village
but
Show,
that's a
Future
Euro,
Village
right?
Show,
That's
Hegel, right?
you're right, but that's a European mindset because European history before the American Revolution, the individual was the subject of the state, the church, whatever. So it's not like Hegel was really inventing something brand new, but bringing it to America now and coming to Dewey and his impact on Dewey. Go ahead from there.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
where
yeah,
you were
well, yeah,
going.
yeah. It's a good point, Robert. It's a good point. Although we got to give credit to the Brits. Locke's influence, and the
Yes,
British
of
were
course.
were,
Hmm.
yeah, Locke. Well, we did a hero show in the past on John Locke. In the second treatise of civil government, where Locke says individuals have an inalienable right to life, liberty, and property. You see the British
Yeah.
moving towards the principle of individual rights, and of course, an abolitionist movement born for the first time in history in Great Britain, based on the burgeoning sense that individuals have a right to their own life and to liberty. So you're absolutely right what you said about European mindset, but the British were starting to throw that off.
Yeah,
Um,
mainland Europe, I should say, I should
yeah,
distinguish because
yeah,
since the Magna Carta, the Brits were always 1 foot in and 1 foot out of Europe. And the 1 foot out was better in exactly that sense, Andy.
yeah,
So go ahead.
right, right.
Hmm.
Um, and so Dewey will see politically. Well, the politics here are important in understanding the ultimate goals of progressive education. There's no separating the principles of progressive education from their ultimate political goals, and they're
Right.
influenced certainly by Hegel. And we'll see that as we go along. But before we get to progressive education, Robert, I think we should mention something about pragmatism, because
Yes.
it's a important philosophy. It's an influential philosophy, and Dewey, along with William James, are the main founders of how it developed in the 20th century. So yeah, I remember studying pragmatism in grad school. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on William James, so yeah, I
Yeah.
know something about this. But pragmatism is briefly on this, and then get into progressive education, right? Because
As
that's
a
that's
as a
where,
philosophy, just to distinguish
yeah,
the term pragmatic, which often means practical, but distinguish, Andy, the actual philosophic
yeah.
definition.
Discuss
Hmm.
pragmatism for a couple of minutes, and then focus on progressive education, because that's what Dewey did his
Yeah.
most disastrous damage. Uh, Pragmatism, first, foremost, and always, is a theory of truth. Uh, and it's the idea that if a proposition, a claim, leads to beneficial results in action, then the proposition is true. That's the essence of
Hmm.
pragmatism. If a claim leads to beneficial results in practice, then the claim is true. Now, James is much better writer than Dewey. He's much easier to read. James's influence was Hume and the empiricist school, where Dewey's influence is
Hmm.
Kant and Hegel. Anyhow, James's example was I'm doing this from memory. It's been a long time since I read William James'
Hmm.
books, Pragmatism and the Meaning of Truth. But you're alone on an island, and you have the idea that there's a freshwater stream on the other side of the island, and so that idea leads you to go circle the island, and maybe you find a whole bunch of coconuts, that you could then drink the milk and eat and eat
Hmm.
what's in what do they call it inside the fruit of a coconut. I'm not sure what the term is for the food of the food,
Yeah, the milk. I don't know if
the
it's the
milk. Yeah,
milk or, but
yeah.
yeah,
Well, you could
it's
drink the
something, the
milk.
white stuff.
Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. You could eat
Or
it. I
like
think
carve
it's
out the, right. Yeah, carve out the
yeah,
chunky. Hmm. Yeah,
yeah. And so
right.
the idea was
Hmm.
beneficial. It led you to to milk and food. So the idea is true. So yes, well, was there a freshwater stream there or wasn't there? Well, that doesn't matter. It led you to
Yeah.
beneficial results. The idea was true. Now James, much more of an individualist than Dewey. He's much more American than Dewey. Dewey's much more
Yes.
German, even though he's born and
Yes.
raised in Vermont. He's German in terms of his philosophy. And again, I don't want to always sound like I'm insulting German culture. The Germans have done a lot of great things. The music, the literature, there's a lot of science, technology,
No, it's a
engineering.
philosophy.
Well,
Yeah,
yes,
the
the
philosophy
philosophy.
that
That's yeah,
denies.
Kant.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Hmm.
Kant, Hegel, and Marx been disastrous.
Yes.
But uh, so James is much more individualist. He's thinking, does this proposition or this claim lead to beneficial results in the life of an individual? Dewey's much more collectivist. He's much more concerned with, does an idea lead to beneficial results in the life of society? So what did I write down as an example? As an example for this. Oh yeah, here's an example I made up because I can't read Dewey, but it's an example I made up for Dewey, harkening back to our hero show episode a few weeks ago about on the great Carl Sagan. So here's a
Yes.
proposition: beaming messages into space will lead us to contact with extraterrestrial intelligence. So we do it,
Mm.
and it results in colonizing Mars. Let's say this project results in colonizing Mars with great benefits to the human race. Well, then the proposition was true. It led to
Hmm.
benefits for mankind, regardless of whether it results in contact with extraterrestrial intelligence. So that's the
Yeah.
essence of pragmatism. Truth
Hmm.
happens to an idea. The pragmatists
Hmm.
like to say they reject the old spectator model, as they call it, where we're sitting here looking at reality, and the idea is true if and only if it's congruent with the facts of reality. That's too passive. The truth
Hmm.
is dynamic. It's active. Truth
Hmm.
happens to an idea. We put it into action, and beneficial results follow. The idea is true. That's the essence of pragmatism. And then they go on to develop it, page after
Yeah.
page after page. But that's the essence of the philosophy.
Hmm. So Dewey, in that sense, as you're saying, if James is more individualistic, more American.
Mhm.
Dewey is bringing in this whole collectivist concept, which again, central to his theory of education is it's not for the purpose of studying geography and mathematics and all. It's for social adjustment. So why don't we go into that, since that's the meat of his villainy? Let's talk about that. And you have first of all, you have a great article. I know you're working on a book about education, but yeah,
Yeah, this
why don't we
is.
go into your article? Yeah, exactly, in the Objective Standard about heroes and villains. So right now we're in the villain stage, and
Yeah, we sure are.
sure,
Look at the face on this
sure
poor
enough,
girl. Look at the face on
yeah.
this poor girl. You could see she must be in the public schools.
Mhm.
The sense of
Yeah,
boredom. She's just bored. The poor kid's bored out of her mind. Uh, and I think we should say something about American education prior to
yeah, you're
progressive.
right. Actually, set the context. The founders, self-taught. Many of them were before then. Yeah, reading, writing,
Yeah,
reasoning was, that was always built into the mindset. That is the way, an observation. of the facts, gaining that which gives you a certain degree of confidence for living in life after education. But yeah, add what you want to that, Andy.
Yeah, we have a lot of proxy data from late the Revolutionary period and the early 19th century, indicating that American literacy levels and education levels were very high. Before we get into that, to
Yes.
point out, like you said, homeschooling was widespread in the American colonies and the early American Republic.
Hmm.
Fathers or mothers would read to the kids at breakfast until the oldest kid became such an accomplished reader that he took up the chores. Reading was a requirement to get into private school, and it was expected to be taught at home, and often was. And look at the proxy
Hmm.
data. I mean, it's really astounding today. Thomas Paine's Common Sense sold, I forget the numbers, but it was a lot in a
25% of Americans bought it. Whatever the population was, 1 in 4 Americans owned Common Sense. Okay,
yeah,
that's how
that's
many
yeah.
copies he sold. Hmm.
Right, right. So something like there was like 2 million or 2.4 free Americans,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
it sold an
Hmm.
enormous amount, equivalent to selling millions and maybe tens of millions of copies today. Now, Common Sense, Thomas Paine's a terrific writer, and it's Common Sense is written in very plain English, but it's articulating sophisticated political principles, and
Yes.
what in 4 Americans bought it, and presumably a large number of those read it. That's a piece of evidence.
Hmm.
The one that really blows my mind, because it's since you're expert on Alexander Hamilton, the essays of the
Newspapers. Yeah.
Federalist.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were
Yeah.
newspaper
Hmm.
editorials. Publius,
Yeah.
Publius, the
Hmm.
pseudonym for Hamilton, Madison, and Jay. Uh,
Yeah.
those are
Hmm.
those are really sophisticated essays. My college students would struggle. Like, I think a lot of college graduates would struggle with the
Hmm.
Federalist, and they were newspaper
Hmm.
editorials written for everyday Americans to read. And we could go
Yep.
on with the proxy data. Early 19th century, when the U.S. population was still been below 20 million. The novels of Sir Walter Scott and James Fenimore Cooper. Again, those are not easy novels to read. They sold
Right.
millions of copies, equivalent to selling
Hmm.
tens of millions of copies today. We have a lot of data like that, and maybe the leading example would be the McGuffey's Readers. From
Hmm.
1836, Thomas Sowell points out, from 1836 to 1920, the McGuffey's Readers sold 120 million copies, and the American
Wow.
population was not that large. But I have a few of the McGuffey's Readers. They're very religious, but the intellectual level is much higher than anything in the inane Dick and Jane readers that they use for
Right.
for the
Hmm.
Lookside method. See Spot run. Come home, Spot. Come home. I mean, this is drivel. This is what the
Hmm.
McGuffey's readers were.
Hmm.
I mean, the first reader is very simple, as would have to be for 5, 6 year old children, but the vocabulary is vastly more extensive than the Dick and Jane readers. The
Hmm.
stories are much fuller and richer. And you go through the McGuffey's readers, and it was like, I forget, like in the third grade reader, they use in terms like Heath and benighted, which means ignorant.
Yeah.
Most of my college students don't know what benighted means. They're too benighted to know what benighted means. It's like in the third or fourth grade reader. And McGuffey
Yeah.
has excerpts from Hawthorne
Hmm.
in the fourth grade
Hmm.
reader and from Shakespeare in the fifth grade reader.
Right.
I mean, these are the books that American kids were taught to read. Their basic education. They're much higher intellectual level than post Dewey and the progressives. So there's a lot of proxy data.
Hmm.
I can give a lot more, but you get the idea. There's a lot of proxy data indicating that American literacy levels and educational levels were substantially higher that 200 years ago than they are today.
Hmm.
And part of the villainy is the establishment of government schools, which Dewey had nothing to do with. Horace Mann is a main figure there,
Hmm.
mid 19th century. When Dewey comes on the scene, turn of the 20th century, the public school system is already in full swing, but it's riding to a significant degree on the momentum of the past. They're still using
Yeah.
phonics to teach reading.
Hmm.
Robert, they're still teaching history, not this weird hybrid called social studies,
Right.
whatever that
Yeah.
is. The
Hmm.
American public school system was much better back then. Dewey and his peers in the progressive movement, they're the ones that primarily responsible for destroying intellectual quality of American education.
Hmm.
So I know
Yeah,
you.
let's give some
Go ahead.
concretes. Yeah, let's give
Yeah.
some concretes, and you can do. I mean, I have a couple of quotes, but let's. Why don't you read something from
Which one
your?
of Dewey's books? Which one of Dewey's books is that? Is that the
This
School and
is selected
Society? Or,
writings.
oh,
It's selective writings on education. So what I cover. Yeah, show that for Elliot. Sorry about that. There we
yeah,
go. And yeah, so one thing, what is freedom? I can say, why don't I just throw this one out at you? He says, find a man who believes that all men need freedom from oppression, no, from oppressive legal and political measures, and you have found a man who carries on the back of his head some heritage of the metaphysical doctrine of free will plus an optimistic confidence in natural harmony. So this is accurate, but he's against this.
right,
This is one of the examples where Dewey is seeing what we consider the best in human nature, the best in America and American education, and he's going against these principles for the point of socialization. That's the thing. He was against the individualist nature of America, and he goes into the importance of what he stresses in socialization. So, how about
right.
we unpack that, Andy?
Sure, sure. Um, yeah, Dewey and his ilk, his peers, William Hurd Kilpatrick, who headed Teachers College, or headed some important department at Teachers College, Columbia University, for
Yes.
many years,
Yes.
considered himself Dewey's leading disciple. And
Yep.
but let's go back a little bit before Columbia. Dewey was teaching philosophy at the University of Chicago, turn of the 20th century, which was a
Hmm.
very young school, had been recently founded. Um, and he and his wife Alice started a school. It became legendary. I think they ran, for young students, elementary school, 1896 to 1904. I think it was called the Laboratory School. And what's
Hmm.
interesting is Dewey becomes enormously influential for arguing against the importance of academic subjects and much more for socializing kids. And yet, at the laboratory school, they did teach. I mean, he had a PhD in philosophy. His his educational background was not in education courses. That's not,
Yes. Right.
that's not,
Yeah.
he taught a
Hmm.
real subject, and they taught real subjects at the laboratory school. I was reading some examples. We mentioned, when we discussed, they studied, the kids studied Columbus, and Henry, we mentioned Henry the Navigator in the Columbus show, who we're going
Yeah.
to do a hero
Hmm.
show. They studied Henry
Yep.
the Navigator, Columbus, and history and mathematics and science and literature. And Diane Ravitch, who's the great historian of American education. Diane Ravitch
Hmm.
points out in one of her books that Dewey himself taught by standing in front of his class and lecturing. So,
The thing he was
so
against. Yeah. Hmm.
yeah,
Hmm.
right, exactly. Now, the good news in Dewey's method is that he thought kids learned by doing, and there's a lot of truth to that. He said that one of
Yeah.
his examples, Dewey said, was I mean, because prior to the progressives, they use that kill and drill method. You sit at the desk and you
Hmm.
memorize. You memorize the multiplication table. You memorize the letters of of the alphabet. And so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And Dewey wanted to liberate kids. Man, here's the good news. This is in Dewey's approach, and and so he said one of his examples was, kids, we're going to do stuff, real life stuff, useful stuff, practical stuff. The kids will learn by doing it. So what was the example? He said, they'll learn to read by studying a cookbook. They'll
Hmm.
they'll learn to write by jotting down recipes. things. They'll learn,
Hmm.
to weigh and measure things by, weighing out flour and eggs. Or they'll learn numbers. And you're baking a cake or whatever it is the project is. And then there's truth to that. But
Yeah.
and by the way, one of the greatest educators of history, Maria Montessori, who we've done that
Same
hero
thing.
show.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And as the hero show goes on, by the way, some of these heroes are so important. We could cycle back to that. What was
Yeah.
somebody we did 2 years ago?
Yeah, I'd like to,
Let's say,
but here's
yeah,
a good contrast, and they were contemporaries, Andy. Like part
right,
of that, I
mhm,
think one of the tragedies, if we could just diverge a little bit here, is that the Deweyites, and I don't know if it was Kirkpatrick or
yeah,
they saw Montessori's method as a threat, and
yes,
they squashed it. And this is, I think, this is one of the tragedies in the history of American 20th century American education. So so you
absolutely right.
see a good similarities, and then where they depart. Montessori was for living on earth and for having these practical skills, observing reality and natures, and then going on to be human beings in the real world as individuals, because it's the child is at his own pace, his or her own pace, and that and their observations teach them what works and what does not work in real life. But Dewey and his accolades saw his difference with the socialization aspect and wanted to squash that individualism of Montessori.
Ah, you're absolutely right. Maria Montessori came to America from her native Italy. Shortly
Hmm.
before World War One, 1911, 1912, she
Yeah.
traveled the country by train, gave lectures to enthusiastic audiences. Montessori schools were opening. Alexander Graham Bell and his wife were, the inventor of the
Yeah.
telephone. They
Hmm.
were fans.
Yep.
And people were writing in magazines and newspapers about the Montessori method and the wonders that she did. And you're absolutely right. William Herd Kilpatrick immediately, again, Dewey's leading disciple, Dewey's attack dog, if you will, wrote a
Hmm.
book attacking Montessori and the Montessori
Hmm.
method. Yeah, it was like
Hmm.
1911, 1912 immediately. And
Right.
and
Yeah.
along with other difficulties, helped squash Montessori schools in America until post World War II. For like 40
Hmm.
years.
Hmm.
But anyhow,
Hmm.
yes. Okay, so we have. I'm always struggling to get this lined up with the camera. You can see that.
Perfectly. Go ahead. Yep, we
Yeah.
see it
Heroes,
perfectly.
heroes and villains in you. Actually, the title is "Heroes and Villains in American Education," but they couldn't get American onto the cover so it's just shortened to U.S. I want to read a little bit from this essay. You know, if you're okay with that
Yep, go ahead.
about
Hmm.
okay. And I want to thank Craig Biddle here, for
Yes.
many reasons, but he has studied Dewey carefully. He pointed out certain things to me about Dewey, good and bad, when I was writing this essay. So
Hmm.
he was very helpful. Anyhow, fit into the social order, conform, adjust, accept. The teacher was to socialize the child. He was not to nurture a love of learning. I don't know why it says he. Most teachers back then were women, weren't they?
It's
But
okay.
anyway,
Yeah.
yeah, it's okay. He or she was not to nurture a love of learning, of thinking, of independent cognition. Whatever else progressive educators disagreed on, this was a cardinal principle of their faith. Independent thinking is useless to society, even dangerous. I mean, for those of us
Mhm.
who read The Fountainhead, could you imagine such a thing?
Yeah.
Independent
Hmm.
thinking is useless to society, even dangerous. As infamously stated by American philosopher John Dewey, quote, the mere absorbing of facts and truths is so exclusively individual an affair that it tends very naturally to pass into selfishness. There is no
Hmm.
obvious social motive for the acquirement of mere learning. There is no clear social gain in success thereat. Unquote from John Dewey. That could be a quote from Ellsworth Toohey, right from
Yep. The
the
similarities are scary on
yeah,
this monster show. Hmm.
right, right. All right. So I go on in this essay to point out the good things in Dewey's method that we just discussed, learning
Hmm.
by doing, and how it's similar to Maria Montessori, that part of it. But Dewey's ultimate aims were another matter. He held all learning is, excuse me, all learning is ultimately for the purpose of, quote, saturating students with the spirit of service, unquote. In Dewey's view, the purpose of education is not to convey, quote, bodies of information and skills that have been worked out in the past, unquote. Not to teach the child, and all these quotes are from Dewey, not to teach the child, quote, science, nor literature, nor history, nor geography, unquote, but rather to prime him for, quote, social cooperation and community life, unquote.
Yep.
That's
Hmm.
that's Dewey himself, talking
Yes.
about the purpose of
Yep.
education is
Yep.
is is
Actually,
is
Andy,
not. Go ahead.
let me just add one paragraph here from his ethical principles. Very similar. He says the child must be educated for as much for leadership as well as for obedience. He must have the power of self direction and power of directing others, powers of administration, ability to assume positions of responsibility. So he wants people who know how, these are power lusters, going to the Ellsworth Toohey to grasp some of Dewey's ideas, to have the student become obedient, to be servants, exactly, paraphrasing what you had just quoted. So it's all over his writings, his ethical principles, his educational ideas. And what I like what we're doing here, we have enough time to do this deeper dive, is that, yeah, writing your dissertation on Kant, showing the influence of Hegel, two of the most influential thinkers, post
Mhm.
Renaissance era, in what we call the modern era. And Dewey is bringing them to America and having them, foisted on and a public, and through government schools. We don't call them public schools; we call them government schools. And
Which
now,
they
after
are.
decades, yeah, there are decades and decades of this impact, just coming back to the zombies that we see walking around today in schools. I mean, they're just people who don't know how to read, write, or reason, but they can text, and they can, they can look at
They could
their
text. Right? They
their
could text. Right.
their phones, yeah, without spelling or anything. And so this is such a tragedy that one man has had so much of an impact on generations and generations, despite, having, as you mentioned, his right hand man Kirkpatrick or Hegel and um, Kant as influences. Dewey is the guy. He is the Immanuel Kant. I mean, we talked about the greatest villain in the literature, and Dewey's the one person, I think, who kind of approximates Ellsworth Toohey more than just about anybody else.
Yeah, in the all important field of education, it's not
Yes.
is not an
Yeah.
accident. Um,
And we've said it before, right? If you fix education, you fix everything. But if you break education, so much else breaks down, which is what we observe today.
right, and Dewey and his disciples, progressive education.
Hmm.
They were opposed to
Hmm.
phonics in
Yes.
teaching reading. That right away is a disaster. And I don't have the quote from Dewey, but he does say that he prefers the look-say method. I guess we should say something on what that is. It's a
Yeah, go
variation
ahead.
on look.
Explain that. Hmm.
Yeah, the
Hmm.
whole word method, right? By contrast, phonics, you learn the sounds of the letters, you learn the sounds each letter makes, and then you could sound out the words on the page. And even in English, which is considered an irregular language, something like 87% of the words in the English language, are phonetic. You could sound them out, and you become an accomplished reader, and then you could learn
Hmm.
the other words that are not phonetic. A word like rough. A kid coming
Yeah.
across it should be, if it was phonetic, it would be spelled RUFF. So a kid coming across at 6 years old or 5 years old for the first time, and the surface was, rough. He could figure it out. He's an accomplished reader, and And
Hmm.
so phonics is the method to teach reading. You 26 letters, 40 something sounds, and then you could
Yeah.
decode thousands and thousands and thousands of words in the English language. It's the time
Hmm.
tried and true method of teaching reading
Yes.
in many different languages. Uh, Now, the word method, the whole word method, on the other hand, no, we're not going to sound out the words. We'll look at the shape of the word in the context, and if we don't know what it is, we guess. And I think Leonard Peikoff used the example. You read, and you got to compliment the student on making a good guess. So maybe the
Yeah.
sentence reads, "I like," Leonard Peikoff's examples. "I like to eat carrots," and the kid reads it, "I like to eat cake." Cake and carrots, they're vaguely similar, and so you got to compliment the kid
Carrot
on a
cake.
good get. Yeah, I like carrot cake from Junior's, right?
Me too.
Carrots cheesecake. And anyhow, uh, so you got to compliment the kid on a good guess. One advocate of the whole word method, where you're looking at the whole word, you're not breaking it down into the letters, to
Hmm.
sound it out phonetically, called reading a psycholinguistic guessing game. So that tells us,
Yeah.
the the
Hmm.
the mentality. Now, this is a disaster. Uh, there's thousands and thousands and thousands of words in the English language. It's impossible
Yes.
to memorize the shape. But, nobody. Einstein couldn't do it. Rand, Shakespeare, the greatest geniuses,
Right.
couldn't do it. It's impossible. Uh, and the irony, Robert, is and everybody, the advocates of the whole word method claim they're against memorization. They don't want the kids memorizing
Hmm.
the alphabet, the
Right.
26
Right.
letters and the 40 somewhat sounds. So
Hmm.
instead of that, they expect the kids to memorize thousands and thousands of words, which
Hmm.
is impossible. And what accounts for the inane drivel, of the Dick and Jane readers, which are using this method. So you gotta, you introduce, like, I don't know, a couple hundred words every grade, and then you gotta use them, over and over and over
Yeah.
again. And
Hmm.
see spot, run spot, run, and it's just it's so inane and so boring. Whereas when you use phonics, you could teach the kids to read in a matter of months, and then you could go off into real literature. You can have them reading really good children's stories. They could be reading
Yeah.
The Secret Garden, or Anne of Green
Hmm.
Gables, or Peter Pan, or stuff
Hmm.
like that. So Dewey
Yep.
said, I don't remember, I don't have the exact quote in front of me, Robert, but Dewey said that he was opposed to phonics, and advocated Look-Say, which is a version of the whole word method, not because he
Hmm.
thought Look-Say was more efficient in teaching reading, but because it wasn't.
Hmm.
He didn't want the kid. He said in so
Right.
many words, he didn't want the kids reading for the reason that we just gave. The
Yeah.
ability to learn autonomously uh, passes very naturally into selfishness. It's way too
Yep.
individualistic for Dewey.
Yeah.
So it's
Hmm.
unbelievable that how open and brazen these guys are about sabotaging, the development of the mind, as they consider it a virtue, and Dewey was
Yeah.
open about it.
Yep. Yeah.
And
Yeah. There's one other.
yeah,
Are
go
you
ahead.
finished with that? Because I had a
Yeah, go.
somewhat
Yeah.
parallel track, Andy, that we talk about the something that could be good. Another point that I think could be good, but he goes down the wrong path, which is the involvement of the student, which has worked if we consider the Socratic method, where they read an assignment and the teacher comes and asks questions and prompts specifics to further enhance their development, and they're an active participant. But Dewey goes around the corner and to advocates what we now call the bull session, where pretty much the student has as much impact as the teacher does. His opinion is just as valid as the teacher, and then it just diminishes to just come unprepared. It doesn't matter. You just say what's on your mind. It's all of these you know uh, irrational aspects of education that is similarly a part of the breakdown in in methodology here.
Yeah, they stay with reading for a second, and then get to
Yeah.
dumbing down the rest of the curriculum.
Hmm.
So
Sure.
this is around the time of World War One. 1918, 1920s. Dewey's teaching
Hmm.
philosophy at Columbia at Columbia University. William Hurd Kilpatrick, his leading disciple, heads, I think it was the philosophy of education department at Columbia
Hmm.
University Teachers College. Teachers College at Columbia was enormously influential. Uh,
Oh
was
yes.
I think
Hmm.
1918 to 1940. Uh, William Hurd Kilpatrick headed this major department at Teachers
Wow.
College. They
Hmm.
trained tens of thousands of American teachers from all over the country
Hmm.
in these methods. And I want to stay with reading for a second because it's the all important skill, right? I mean,
Yes.
to me the most important skill to get a good education is you read. If you could read, the whole world of knowledge is open to you. And if you're a proficient reader, and it's not that hard. A healthy human being can learn to read, just like riding a bike or swimming or running. Reading for a healthy
Hmm.
human being is very easy using the right method. But in
Yep.
1955, Rudolf Flesch, an Austrian immigrant to America, wrote a ground shaking book called Why Johnny Can't Read. And
Mm.
Flesch was from Austria, and he pointed out throughout Europe, Austria and throughout Europe, there were few or no remedial reading problems. They used phonics, and the kids learned how to read. And Flesch
Hmm.
argued that prior to roughly 1920s, there were no remedial reading problems in America either. They used phonics. The kids learned how to read. But now, 35 years later, 1955, Why Johnny Can't Read was published, because of the rejection of phonics by the teachers' colleges, who taught the teachers, who then taught the kids.
Hmm.
They
Hmm.
rejected phonics, used look-say, or the whole word method, and had a lot of remedial reading problems. And Flesch pointed out this is very easily remediated. Junk the whole
Yeah.
word method, get rid of look-say, and use phonics. And
Hmm.
Flesch directed his book to the parents, and his book sold millions of copies, and the parents were outraged. And phonics made a comeback, for a while,
Yes.
until for maybe 20 or 30 years, until it was replaced by the whole language method, which is just
Hmm.
which is just look say or whole word method tricked out with literature, and it was a disaster. They
Hmm.
recognized that the kids need great literature, but using the whole word method, one teacher put it, they were surrounded with these great works of literature, and the kids can't read it.
Yeah.
It was a,
Yeah.
and
Hmm.
anyway, phonics made a
And
comeback for a while.
as we
Go
mentioned,
ahead.
Andy, if I could just jump in the Marva Collins episode,
Yeah,
she had 10-year-olds reading Shakespeare, reading Ivanhoe, and all these other great works of literature that they were capable of it. You just have a good teacher. And then also a
right,
private alternative. If you remember the taped courses Hooked on Phonics, that was an example where government schools were failing. Parents wanted kids to learn how to read. So some private company comes up with this Hooked on Phonics, and it's,
right,
sells like, millions and millions of
right.
subscriptions there. So,
Right,
mhm.
right. And there's the truth. I mean, Montessori, again, very good on this. You integrate great literature with phonics, not great literature
Yes,
with the whole word method. So
yes.
you integrate great literature with the reading method that works, not with the reading method that doesn't work. And can you imagine
Yep.
how frustrated that is for kids? You got this great book in front of you and you can't read it.
Hmm.
I, I've seen it with my college kids.
Hmm.
I could tell.
Yeah.
Let's give one example. I won't mention
Yep.
any names. Uh, I was teaching a course, philosophic themes in literature. It was a great
Hmm.
course because we read all this. We read Antigone, and we read Inherit the Wind, and we read Anthem, and we read a
Mm.
bunch of great short
Hmm.
stories. And we did it to discuss the philosophy, to teach philosophy through literature, which I think is a great, is a great method.
Yes.
So I had the students read aloud in class for a while, and I can always tell the kids who were taught by phonics, they came across a word they didn't know, they tried to sound it out. The kids who were taught by the word method, when they come to a word they don't know, they stop. They weren't taught to sound it out. Maybe weren't even allowed to sound it out. They just stop, and they don't
Hmm.
know.
Hmm.
They don't know what the word is,
Hmm.
and of course they were encouraged to guess. It was embarrassing how many of the kids just couldn't sound out the words. I stopped. I stopped doing that. And if we had to read aloud in class, I did it. I did it.
Yeah.
And I realized that this was 2006. The class I was teaching at a
Mm.
good college, And I realized, my God, I thought I was naive enough to think that look-say had been replaced by phonics. I said, oh my God, they're still using look-say. They're still using the whole word method. I was
Yeah.
dismayed as well as shocked. But this is Dewey's influence, and they proceeded to
Hmm.
dumb down the rest of the curriculum. Did away with history. What is social
Yep.
studies? What does that even mean?
Hmm.
I mean, that was 100 years ago. They did that. When you and I were
Wow.
going through school, we took social studies classes, right? Some
Yeah,
of it
we
was
did.
history,
Yeah.
and some of it, yeah,
I
some of
studied
it was
history on
whatever.
my own. You're right. Hmm. Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, my
Yeah.
students don't know any history. I'll give you again. I won't mention any names. Heartbreaking example. Right before the pandemic, so this was February 2020. Right before the pandemic shut us down and sent everything online.
Hmm.
I'm in class, logic class, 20 students, all of them born, reared, educated in America. So I want to use James Madison as an example. I think I mentioned this previously. I mean, that's safe. Everybody knows James Madison. 10 out of 20 students, 50% of the class, never heard of him. They never heard of James Madison. You know,
Hmm.
the other 10 knew the name. He'd been
Hmm.
president of the United States. Not one in 20 had the slightest idea that he was the lead author of the U.S. Constitution and virtually the sole author of the
Wow.
Bill of Rights. Not one in 20 in 2020.
Hmm.
And this is not atypical anymore. This is the norm. And this is
Yeah.
Dewey's influence. We're going to dumb down the academic program. And we before we run out of time, we should get into the politics because politics plays a key role here. As we said, well,
Yeah.
why? Why don't you want these kids to know history? Why don't you want them to read well? Why don't you want them to be able to write a college level essay? Why don't you want them to know, be strong in mathematics? Well, let's see. I got I got it. I got it right here in this essay. Because a
Hmm.
lot of it is politics. Okay, so not surprising. Kilpatrick admired the Soviet Union. And when he
Yeah.
visited it in 1929, he was delighted to see his project method in action. For instance, he
Mhm.
witnessed groups of students, quote, disposing of disintegrated carcasses of animals left frozen by the roadside, unquote. Could you imagine that happening in America?
Oh, boy.
Get dead animals lying by the roadside. You get a bunch of kids bunch of high school kids to drag them off. Anyway, Kilpatrick saw that in the Soviet Union. He liked it. And he
Hmm.
reported, quote, no school system in history has been more thoroughly and consistently made to work into the social and political program of the state, unquote. Yeah, I'll bet that was true. He was right.
Hmm.
They
Hmm.
incorporated this method under communism to serve the state.
Yeah.
Dewey, Dewey
Amazing.
also pilgrimage. Dewey also pilgrimage to the Soviet Union in 1929 and quote was deeply moved by what he saw, unquote. He reported
Mm.
that Soviet educators, quote, realized that the goals of the progressive school were undermined by the egoistic and private ideals and methods inculcated by the institutions of private property, profit, and acquisitive possession, unquote.
Mm.
From Dewey. He
Yeah.
recognized the pervasiveness of communist propaganda in the country, but excused it because it promoted, quote, the good of humanity, unquote, rather than private gain.
Hmm. Mm.
And so on. These guys not only pilgrimage to the Soviet Union, they loved it. And this is
Yeah.
Stalin. Stalin's in power. What
Hmm.
did Lincoln Steffens infamously say when he visited the Soviet Union? I have seen the future and it works. Right?
Uh,
Yeah. Well, if you
yeah.
want to kill millions of people, it
Yes.
works. If you
Yeah.
want to build a
Hmm.
society of freedom and prosperity, it does work.
Hmm.
He was glowing about the Soviet Union. And
Mm.
there's a big old clue, a big old clue for us. If
Yep.
you train kids, if intellectual training is your goal, as for Maria Montessori and as we think,
Hmm.
develop independent thinking, develop kids to grow up to be like Howard Roark. We're not all going to be geniuses like Roark, but we can be independent thinkers, be like Mike Donegan, right? We could, and
Yes.
if that's if that's the goal, then do we realize a society of independent thinkers are going to want political independence? They're going to want to run their own lives. They could think.
Yes.
You know,
Hmm.
they could judge for themselves. They could choose their own values. They could run their own lives as long as they're not criminals, as Ayn Rand
Hmm.
puts it. As long as they do not initiate force or fraud against innocent victims, they're free to direct their lives by their own judgment. Well, if you don't want that, if you want people to serve the state, if you want to turn America into something akin to the Soviet Union, well, you don't want them
Hmm.
thinking for themselves, and you don't want them, gaining. You don't want intellectual training as the purpose of education. You don't want them to read well. You don't want them to write well. You don't want them to learn basic arithmetic and math. You don't want them reasoning. You don't. No. And so the goal of education became, the full academic program. They used the IQ testing had just come in at that time, early 20th century. Stanford Binet
Hmm. Hmm.
use the IQ. I remember taking all these IQ tests as a kid, in the public schools. Uh, you know, and we use the IQ test and we determine who are the best and the brightest. And they get the full academic program. They get reading, writing, math, history, science, and
Yeah.
so forth. Because they're going to college, they're going to be
Hmm.
society's future leaders. The rest of us, the
Right.
not so bright kids, we don't need that much intellectual training. We get the basics of it, but we should be getting vocational training and practical skills, and and Dewey and the progressives thought in the rural areas, you teach farming skills. In the urban areas, the kids are going to be factory workers. You teach them, metal shop, wood shop, and and stuff,
Hmm.
and that's become. But the the bias here towards most people should not get the full academic program, because one, there's only two things we need, most of us. One, to be good at our jobs, and two, to obey the wise rulers of the state, who get the
Yeah.
full. We obey, the Hillary Clintons of the world.
Hmm.
She's smart. She went to, where'd she go?
Hmm.
Wellesley, or maybe,
Yeah. Well,
Yale,
yeah.
Yale law school. Well, she's smart, no doubt about that. She's also evil, but
Hmm.
that's another matter.
Yes.
you know, as we obey,
Hmm.
the Hillary Clintons who run, the wise educated rules. It's very platonic. You have the philosopher king, or
Yes.
you have the
Hmm.
few highly trained intellectuals, and the rest of us are good at our jobs and obey. And it's Plato filtered through Marx, scientific socialism.
That's right.
The
Yeah.
economists, you have a planned
Hmm.
economy. The economists plan out the economy. Plan society. The social scientists plan out society. My place in it, your place in it, and you and I are good at our
Hmm.
jobs, and we obey the wise rules of the state. The wise rules of the state, on this elitist view, know how to run my life better than I do.
Yes.
And you and
Yep.
I, we're stubborn, recalcitrant American individualists. We want to fight now. We want to run our own lives. What's wrong with you people? This is Terry McAuliffe,
Yeah.
right? Parents shouldn't tell
Hmm.
the schools how to educate their children. What are you? Who the hell are you to think that you know better than the experts?
Hmm.
Shut up, right? Well, you're a bunch of
Yeah.
domestic terrorists. Shut up and just listen to the wise rulers of the public schools, of the government, and we're just
Yeah.
stubborn, selfish individuals. We have this funny idea that I could run my
Hmm.
life better than the wise rulers of the state can. Imagine that.
Yeah.
But that's the ultimate goal. That's why you
That's
want
the
to dumb
ultimate
down the
goal, Andy.
education
Yep.
system. That's the ultimate goal.
Yeah. And one of the most, so let's tie in a couple of themes here. Talking about experiencing what was going on in the Soviet Union, bringing in the idea of monsters for this Halloween themed show. One of the best articles that Ayn Rand has ever written comes from the Victor Hugo Manoleff's
Mhm.
story of the Comprachicos, where in his book, the they take children at a young age and they mold them. They put them into these little vases and or just they distort their physical features. And of course, Rand shows the parallel for the child's mental features. And you can see how she's bringing up the whole episode, everything we're talking about, John Dewey and his impact. Rand is giving example after example um, in her article, The Comprachicos. And I think that's just one, that's to me the best dramatization or explanation of this entire collapse in education that we've seen. And that was in the 1960s that she wrote that. So now that's, 50 something years of the same dominant trend. Fortunately, and we'll go into some alternatives. We'll end on what good options there are. But do you want to just talk to that, Rand's Comforchico's article?
You know, oh yeah, the Compa is devastating. Oh my God, where Ayn Rand shows the impact of progressive education, where the kids are not taught to to think. They're not taught basic cognitive skills. That they're taught they have to
Hmm.
conform to the group, and then
Yeah,
some some when what does Ellsworth Toohey say when somebody's when they're demanding you to to perform sacrifices, you can be sure somebody's going to collect the
somebody's gonna.
sacrifices.
Yeah,
Yeah, collect
that's
the
right.
sacrifices. When
Hmm.
when you and I have to conform to the group, somebody's going to lead the group. Like a was
Yes,
Ayn Rand would call it a wolf pack, right? And it's just
yes,
and
that's right.
you have
Yep,
to and you have to
the most
obey.
powerful. Hmm.
Yeah,
The
the
most
alpha, the
physically
alpha wolf.
powerful that she.
Yeah,
That's right. And
yeah,
she even says the kids, the goon squad kids who, basically back up what the teacher's saying. When you have that one independent kid who's trying to assert his individuality, then you get the goon squad against him saying, no, you're no better than us, and
right,
so yeah,
right.
that's something I just recommend. I'll just say that article is just
Yeah,
absolutely one of the best, most devastating attacks on progressive education.
right. It is absolutely
Mhm.
devastating. And in contrast to Maria Montessori, and she's just a brilliant educator. You can tell she cares about the kids.
Yes.
The kids,
Yes.
she recognizes, we're individuals. We need to develop our mind to function independently. And the kids can work alone if they want. They can, they
Mhm.
could be reading. If I was a kid in the Montessori school, I was always a literature guy. I'd be focused on literature. I
Mhm.
might be reading some book, and another kid can come over and ask me if he or she can work with me, and it's my choice to say yes or no. We can work together or no, as the kid himself sees.
Mhm.
But under the
Mhm.
progressives, as Iran points out, you don't have that choice. You can't say no to the group.
Right.
They demand that
Yeah.
that you work with the group. You're not allowed to work uh, independently, and you can see the purpose here is to destroy individuality, and to
Yes.
to, to make us into
Mhm.
pack animals. We're
Yeah.
we're just members of the wolf pack, and we have to obey
Mhm.
the alpha. We have to obey the leader of the pack. It's devastating. I know we're running out of time. We should point out something here, though. And so it's really underscore how evil Dewey and Kilpatrick and the progressives were. Uh,
Mhm.
in the 1920s and 1930s, a couple of leading educators named Mortimer J. Adler and Robert Maynard Hutchins developed what
Mhm.
became known as the Great Books approach.
Yes.
And it's
Mhm.
influential to this day. St. John's College, which
Mhm.
has branches in Annapolis and Santa Fe, from what I understand, is very good. And other schools too use the Great Books approach.
Mhm.
And Adler's an interesting guy, Rob, because he may be the only guy in history who has a PhD. I think it was from psychology from Columbia, of all places, who never graduated from either high school or college. He was that much of an
Right.
autodidact.
Yeah. Mhm.
Anyhow, the Great Books approach is interesting because they recommend exactly that we read all the great works of the Western canon.
Yes.
You know,
Mhm.
if you and I would be from Homer to Ayn Rand, and in
Mhm.
literature, in history, in science, and you're reading Euclid's Elements, and you're reading Galileo, and you're reading Newton, and you're reading all the
Mhm.
great philosophers, and it's I don't think it's the ideal approach to education, but it's a lot better than what the
Yes.
progressives offered. And
Mhm.
Robert Maynard Hutchins and Mortimer J. Adler, who at the
Adler.
University of Chicago, yeah, Adler, University of Chicago, 1920s, 1930s. Their explicit purpose was train the mind, train the
Yeah.
intellect. Now,
Mhm.
listen to listen to Hutchins and Dewey, on this. Further, and Diane Ravitch, the leading historian of American education, has a lot to say on this.
Mhm.
Further, Kilpatrick, like Dewey and other progressives, was scathing in his condemnation of the great books advocates, comparing Hutchins with William Bagley, who was a progressive
Mhm.
educator, slightly less sightless, opposed to academics, Diane Ravitch wrote, quote, Bagley annoyed progressive educators, but Robert Maynard Hutchins drove them into a rage. Unthinkable, his claim that the fundamental purpose of education was intellectual training. Unthinkable.
Mm.
This is
Mhm.
Diane Ravitch writing.
Mhm. Mhm.
Unthinkable. Adler and Hutchins claimed that the fundamental purpose of education was intellectual training. Ravitch continues, quote, William Hurd Kilpatrick was horrified by Hutchins. I mean, I can't even get my head around it. He's horrified,
Mhm.
because Hutchins
Yeah.
wants these kids to train their mind and read all these great works. He's horrified by it.
Mhm.
Kilpatrick fulminated that Hutchins was an authoritarian whose ideas were out of step with, quote, every intellectual advance of the last 300 years, unquote. Worse, quote, from Kilpatrick, Dr. Hutchins stands near to Hitler. When you have a professed absolute, then you have to have some authority to give it content. And there the dictator
Mhm.
comes in, unquote, from
Mhm.
Kilpatrick, comparing the great books guys to Hitler. So,
Wow.
continue here.
That
Dewey.
clearly that method has stopped, right? That's we haven't heard that since
Yeah,
then,
yeah, no,
right?
no, I haven't heard anybody who might vaguely,
Comparisons. Yeah.
yeah, who might vaguely support capitalism and America be called Hitler. I haven't heard that in a long time. So,
No.
continuing here, Dewey also excoriated the great book supporters. Uh, Dewey also compared Hutchins to the dictatorial powers of 1930s Europe. As Diane Ravitch wrote, astonishingly, Dewey went so far as to imply that Hutchins was ideologically linked with the jackbooted thugs who were then brutalizing Europe. And she quotes
Mhm.
Dewey. She quotes Dewey. I would
Mhm.
not intimate that the author, Hutchins, has any sympathy with fascism, although he just did. Uh,
Yeah.
but basically, his ideas, Hutchins' ideas, as to the proper course to be taken is akin to the distrust of freedom and the consequent appeal to some fixed authority that is now overrunning the world. Unquote from Dewey,
Mhm.
unquote from Diane Ravitch. Now, I commented on
Mhm.
this. Further,
Mhm.
consider the twisted logic and bitter irony of Soviet apologists imputing support for totalitarianism to those seeking to nurture independent cognition. I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
what? What?
Mhm.
I mean, that's just
Mhm.
dishonest. These
Yeah.
guys admire Stalin, and they're accusing.
But choose to live in America, right? They go there briefly. How many of them defected and said, "Okay, this since this is the ideal, I will choose to live here." No, they just come back to America and implement their bad ideas here. But go ahead, Andy. You're making another point.
Yeah, in fact, you reminded me. I remember once having this conversation with my sister, who you're good friends with, who's a very smart,
Mhm.
very honest, very
Yeah.
commonsensical person, and somebody who claimed to some American claimed to love life in Cuba and love Castro, and she said
Oh yeah.
very rationally, very well, why don't they go live there? Which is a very
Yeah.
rational question,
Exactly.
and the
Yeah.
answer, yeah, and the answer, of course, is they don't want to live in Cuba. They want to live. They want to live in a communist country. They want to live in America and make you and I live under communism. That's
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
That's
Yep. Hmm.
that's their goal.
Sadly.
But I mean, these guys admire Stalin and love the Soviet Union. And here, Adler and Hutchins are training people to think independently, which politically could only
Hmm.
lead to political independence. And they're accusing them of
Hmm.
being Nazis and fascists. Now that's just dishonest.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
worse than dishonest. That's evil.
Hmm. So how about we end with some positive alternatives, Andy, that are there are some good signs out there. Private education, homeschooling, Montessori method is coming is there's a resurgence there. And what do you see, the next 10, 15 years, even the introduction of technology as alternatives to the rigid government school um, system that we have right now.
Yeah, this week in this regard, and I think there is some good news here. And the pandemic actually had some value here
Yes.
because kids are
Yes.
taking classes at home, and parents have much more, interaction than with what the kids are actually learning. And I think a lot of parents were absolutely appalled at one,
Yes.
the very low level of academic education that's going on, and two, the incessant propaganda.
A high
The
level of indoctrination. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, the
Hmm.
critical race theory, the man-made global warming,
Yeah.
capitalism is
Hmm.
terrible, socialism is good. It's just that parents are shocked, and we've seen a lot of parents pull their kids out of schools, and start the homeschool.
Hmm.
We'll see if that continues hopefully that continues as the kids gradually go back to school. But homeschooling has picked up. It's picked up. Our good friend Brad Thompson, who runs the
Yes.
Clemson
Hmm.
Institute for the
Hmm.
study of capitalism. Professor Thompson pointed out that the leading demographic in homeschooling their kids are Black Americans and other minority
Yeah.
groups, which I think is
Hmm.
a great sign,
Good sign.
because
Yeah.
yeah, because the schools in the public schools are typically bad. But in the black urban neighborhoods where there's a lot of violence, unfortunately, very often they're
Hmm.
especially bad. And so to see black
Right.
parents, and Latino parents pull their kids out of school, homeschool them, is I think is a very good sign. You see the
Hmm.
parents, going to school board meetings, outraged about the indoctrination that goes on in the schools, including critical race theory,
Yeah.
which claims,
Hmm.
one, that America in 2021 is a nation of systemic racism. Everything about America is racist, and two, white
Yeah.
people are inherently racist. So the
Hmm.
critical race theory is just racist filth, and you see more and more American parents, including a number of Black American parents, speak out against this. This
Yeah.
is this is pushing us
Hmm.
deliberately towards race war. And Candace Owens is very
Yeah.
good, when she speaks,
Oh,
to
yeah.
this. And
Hmm. Hmm.
I think more and more parents are getting involved. And I mentioned Terry McAuliffe before, who's running for governor, former governor, running for governor of Virginia,
Hmm.
telling parents to basically back off and shut up. That parents shouldn't have a say in how the schools teach their kids. And a lot of parents
Hmm.
are seeing they're legitimately and genuinely outraged by it, and they're demanding
Yeah.
change. I don't know if they could change the government school system. What E.D. Hirsch called an impregnable fortress. It may well be an impregnable fortress. But part of my book,
Hmm.
why Johnny still can't read, is that we can
Hmm.
circumvent the fortress. We can
Yeah.
circumvent it with homeschooling, with tutors, with forming small
Hmm.
community schools. There's
Yep.
ways to get around it to greatly enhance the
Hmm.
education of children. And a lot of parents homeschool without realizing it. They'll teach the
Yeah.
kids the letters of the alphabet before they go to school. They'll teach the kids the multiplication
Hmm.
table before going to school. A lot of parents will help their kids with homework after school. There's a lot of after school, training
Hmm.
parents do. This is all a form of
Hmm.
homeschooling, and I
Yeah.
think the evidence points to this growing and continuing to grow. And if so, that's two big thumbs up,
To,
for that.
for that.
I think the key point here, to resuscitate American education, is this: parents must have full control over the education of their
Yes.
children.
Yep. Absolutely. And Andy, I would add to that the work that we're doing, Objective Standard Institute, is giving courses, one of which upcoming is your course on literature. You said you're a literature guy and you have some less popular works. Students can attend this course for free. All they need to do is go to our site, objectivestandard.org, and fill out the scholarship form, and you can get access to Andy's upcoming course next week, right? It starts
Yeah, November 2nd. That's
uh,
that's next Tuesday, right?
November 2nd. Yeah, next Tuesday. So we're doing our job. OSI and you are doing some of the work towards this alternative education where you actually learn to think for yourself. And literature, we've said over and over again, is a great means to that end. So I know we salute normally. I don't know if you want to do a Bronx cheer
See
since
the,
we're both New
the
Yorkers.
thumbs down.
Two
Boo!
thumbs
Yeah,
down.
boo! Boo for John
Okay.
Dewey, William Herschel,
We'll,
Patrick, and the Progressives. Boo! And
all right, next
everybody,
week we'll be on a
yeah,
higher note.
yeah, we're back to the hero show next week. Every
Yeah.
6 months or so we
Uh-huh.
do a villain show, but we're back
Yeah.
to the hero show next week. So everybody, you know, be aware of what the bad guys have done to American education. Stand up and speak out in
Yeah.
whatever forum is open
Yes.
to us.
Absolutely.
To
Hmm.
live more heroically, because education, especially in the field of education, which is most fundamental. And we will be
Yes.
back next week
Next week
with the Hero Show. So have a
with an
heroic
actual
day, Robert.
hero. Yep.
Yeah,
You too.
absolutely.
Thank you, Andy.
All
Bye
right.
bye, everyone.
Bye.